We want to pick up where we left off last week with a question that Leah asked about how tall Robinson's arch was. The best measurement I found is 56 feet. That was from where they think the road was, the Great Western Road that ran along the north-south road that ran along the west side of the temple. 56 feet from there to the spring of the arch. Now the spring of the arch means that row of stones which is still there, and there's talk about trying to rebuild it as a tourist attraction or something. But the spring stones are still along that western wall, embedded in the wall, and so you know where the arch started. I know it was about 49 feet across. Therefore, you know how high the top of the arch. It was a Roman arch. It was semicircular. So 56 feet. Now, on top of the arch, of course, you've got a lot of stone that has to be on top of you can't just have the arch of one row of stones. And so we don't know how much stone was above the opening up to the roadbed, but it had to be maybe 6, 10 feet, who knows. So anyway, 56, somewhere over 60 feet from the road up to where you walked across to the temple. Okay, now if you're looking at it from the other side, coming down, the staircase down the side of the mountain was about 114 feet. Of course, it bent around, it came out going west, and then it turned south, and then it turned east, down to, and there was that great plaza that was down at road level. So it was quite a few steps, and usually in Herod's temple, a step was a half a cubit, which in our terms is about 10 inches, we think, from the cubit that was used in the temple, about 10 inches, and that's a big step. If you have a 2-story house, you probably have the risers on your staircase, maybe, if it's kind of steep, maybe 6 inches, maybe 5.5, depending on how steep your staircase is. But you're talking about taking a lot of steps of 10 inches to get to the top of the temple. Does that answer your question? Okay. So that's left over from last week. The arch itself, of course, it was 49 feet, and the walk was about 50 feet wide. They call it a 4-lane highway, those stairs down the side of the hill, about 50 feet wide. So it was a grand staircase, to say the least. Tonight we're going to try and maybe see both the remaining videos I want to show. This first one, and I'll point out as the video goes along, some obvious inaccuracies and some obvious things that are still in dispute. One of the things you'll see that we talked about a little bit last week was the roof of the royal portico. Was it tile or was it flat? In this video tonight, the video presents the royal portico as having a flat roof. I told you last week that the Romans poured concrete. Actually, the sanctuary, they poured concrete as the roof of the sanctuary. And so they very well could have done the same thing, although many depictions, and this drawing, which somebody made, shows it as being sloped, and the center portion sloped and tiled. Also, if you look at the drawing, look at the sanctuary, the temple, over there just past the crease. This was obviously copied from a book or something. The sanctuary is shown in this drawing. Notice that there are only storage rooms around the sides, and that is not right. The storage rooms went all the way around from the porch on the front. It went all the way around. The 3 levels of storage rooms were U-shaped. They went all the way around. And we'll talk when we get into a description of the temple. You'll see how you got from one side to the other and how you got around those storage rooms. But they went all the way around. So that's an inaccuracy in this drawing, and it's even worse in the video tonight. The video shows no storage rooms at all, just a blank wall. We know that the sanctuary, the holy place, the most holy place, not the most holy place, but the holy place had windows. And the reason we know that is because the prophecy of Zechariah, they were told to make 4 crowns. Those 4 crowns were in windows in the sanctuary, and young priests would climb those golden chains that hung down in the portico to the top to look into the sanctuary and try and see those 4 crowns that were in those windows of the sanctuary. So the video tonight shows the sanctuary with no windows. That's not true, and it doesn't show any storage rooms at all. It's just a massive wall with no windows, clear up to the level of the porch. Both of those things are known to be inaccurate, to be wrong. Now, another thing we haven't talked about. On the drawing, you look down the road, going from south to north there along the west wall, the main road there. You'll see there are 2 gates. They're not at road level, but they're up some steps off the main road. The one that is closest to us on the southwest corner is called Barclay's Gate. He discovered it. He was an American Christian missionary. He discovered the ruins of that gate. And further down you have a second gate that is known today as Wilson's Gate. Now, one thing you can do if you go online, if you go to Jerusalem, a lot of these areas are open, and you can tour for a price. You can go through many of these areas that are not under Muslim control. But one of these 2 gates on the west side, Herod named after the first procurator of Judea. Now, when the Romans conquered an area and Herod came from the military side, the military was in charge. At some point after things settled down, a civil governor was appointed. The first governor of Judea was a man by the name of Kapaa, C-A-P-O-N-I-U-S, Kapaa. And so Herod named one of these 2 gates that we now call Barclays or Wilson's, down there, not on the road, but a little bit up on a ramp that ran along there, a sidewalk, grand sidewalk along there. One of those 2 gates was probably called the Gate of Kapaa, and to honor the first governor of Judea after the military turned it over to a representative of Rome that was not part of the army. Now, to show that the temple was under the control of Rome and the protection of Rome, over the Kapaa Gate, whichever one and wherever one it was, Herod put a golden eagle. What was the eagle? Representative of Rome. And of course, as I think I told you maybe in the first lesson, as soon as the Jews revolted later on, guess what came down first? The golden eagle. But that gate was named in honor of this first governor. So that's one of those gates along the west side. Now those gates you don't have the great distance you have to get up to Robinson's Arch, and that road is going up as it goes north, but it's still, you have inside stairways inside the wall going up to the porticos or the other gatehouses there on that side of the wall. Apparently neither of these gates came out into the plaza like the mole gates. Another thing that's inaccurate, the mole gates are shown in the video as just going up and opening up on the plaza, hardly any even a wall around them to keep kids from falling down. Of course the Jews never would have done that. And remember, the law said even the top of your flat roof of your house, that you're going to go up in the top of the house and enjoy the roof of your house, you've got to have a parapet around it so people don't fall off. And so the video shows practically no wall around these gates, and they also would have been roofed, so the rain, when it rained, didn't run down the stairs and make them any more slippery than they had to be. And so those are some inaccuracies, I think, and you'll see in tonight's video. Let me consult my notes and see. On one other gate, we talked about the east gate, which was the original gate of the temple and remained under Herod's temple as the ceremonial gate because it went out into the Kidron Valley. It was ceremonial and There were other gates on that side too. But the original gate, when they built, and this is a problem when you try and read about Herod's temple. Sometimes it has become obvious to me, sometimes you're reading and they're talking about Zerubbabel and what Zerubbabel built and what was built after Zerubbabel. And we know that the Hasmoneans enlarged the court around Zerubbabel's temple and made it more grand. But sometimes it seems they're to be talking about Zerubbabel's temple. In the case of Zerubbabel's temple, that eastern gate was called the Susa or the Shushan gate. Well, what was Susa or Shushan? Persian word for lilies. Where did Daniel stomp around in other places? Susa or Shushan, great fortress of the Persian Empire. And in recognition and acknowledgement and thankfulness of what Cyrus and the Persian Empire did, the lintel over that eastern gate, at least sometime Zerubbabel, whether it still existed in the time of Jesus, I don't know. The lintel of that gate was carved with a representation of the great fortress at Shushan, where the Persian kings, of course, spent this, I think that was one of the summer capitals, where they moved to get out of the heat of the desert. So it was called the Shushan Gates. By the time of Jesus, whether that lintel still existed or not, and whether it was still called the Shushan Gate, I don't know. But at least it started out in recognition under the time of the Old Testament times of what Cyrus did and not only allow them to rebuild the temple, but to finance a great deal of it. So I'm just trying to tie up the loose ends of all the gates, and I think that's maybe it. You'll notice this is very similar. This video was done by the same people did the one we didn't get to see in class last time because the laptop decided it was going to shut down even though it still had battery. And their programs get a little bit more sophisticated. Instead of just plain representation, if you look at this on your computer screen at home, you'll see the houses look like they have stone walls and plaster falling off, and but it's the same, essentially the same video as we would have looked at in class last time if we had not had computer problems. Okay, they're here. Now we're up to the Great Plaza here. Shops along the right and the left going north. Wilson's Arch behind Robinson's. Now they're scanning up here to this corner of the temple tower, and this will be where the video ends, by the way, for reasons that will become evidence shortly. But now they're going to go back down. Now instead of going, they're going to show us if we'd gone up the staircase over Robinson's Arch into the west end of the Royal Portico. But this video we're not. We're going to turn around and decide, no, I don't want to go that way. I'm going to go through one of the mole gates. And so you see now that you start from this plaza level, multiple levels, huge staircase going up this south wall up to the mole gates. They call the Hodal gates after the prophetess that prophesied in the Old Testament in this area. So they named them after her. They were called mole gates because they come up through a hole in the plaza. So you see, it depends on how many stairs. You can go up a little bit here, you could go from the other side, but you're going to end up at the same place at this end at these gates. Now there were two at the other that are called the triple gates now, but the triple gates were added. They really were inside, they were just like these, which was a typical Roman temple configuration. This area is still open, you can go in. The ceiling detail is still there. And an interesting thing, people tried to complain that these domes inside, you'll see they're very flat. I hope you can see. No, it's going to wash out. the domes are very flat, and so people said that the Romans never built a dome that flat. They would have built a dome that's almost semicircular at least, or closer. But it turns out that apparently 200 years later they built an amphitheater theater at Ephesus, and the domes there are almost exactly the same, as if there was a copybook going around the Roman world, and somebody said, well, let's copy the domes that Herod used. Okay, we come up. Now, notice here, the temple goes straight up the top. There are no storerooms. That's incorrect. There are no storerooms. It goes clear to the top. There are 3 gates here into the court of the priest and Israel. And when they pan a little bit, you'll see the 4th gate that should have been there is missing, the gate into the court of the women. Okay, here is the fence that's and this would have been where the inscriptions were. Any Gentile caught beyond this point or unclean person is responsible for his own demise. The descriptions of it was that it was actually the stone part was lower and it was a lattice work, very fancy lattice work above the stone. But I always thought, when the Hebrew writer talks about the middle wall of partition, I've always imagined a huge wall and an inscription, don't go through this wall. It was just a little stone fence with a wooden lattice work, because everybody knew what it was. Now you see, when you go east, the court of the women there has no gate in this video, an obvious mistake. And why they didn't catch that, I don't know. Then we have the east gate into the court of the women just barely showing, and the tall gate on the far west side, of course, that is where Wilson's Arch is, and the causeway that would have come over the valley and the road from that side. Now here's the royal portico. Notice again, we've got the flat roof this time, no tile roof, and the 162 columns plus the embedded columns on the other side. Huge space.
Is this the portico called Beautiful?
No, there's no portico called Beautiful. There's the royal portico. This is the royal portico. There's Solomon's portico. You're thinking the gate is called Beautiful, and that we'll talk about in a minute when the video is over or while it's going. Nobody knows in the New Testament, remember the lame man? Peter and John going into the temple, laying at the beautiful gate. The New Testament is the only place we hear a gate of the temple called the beautiful gate. Yes, sir.
For how big the actual temple is, how long did it take for them to completely finish it?
Well, remember the life of Jesus? Jesus said, okay, let's get this and then I'll answer your question. Okay, here is that corner where we were looking up at the beginning. And there is a fellow here with a trumpet. Remember, there was a feast of trumpets. They blew trumpets to announce Sabbath days, feast days. Here's a fellow blowing a trumpet. And that stone that he's standing in front of, when the temple was destroyed, when this wall was, and that parapet off that tower was thrown into the valley below, that stone was recovered. And if you stopped it and look at it, when you watch it on your computer at home, you will see it has Hebrew writing, and that stone is in a museum, and it says, to the trumpeting place. And that's where a priest or a Levite would go and announce whatever is being announced with the trumpet, there on that very southwest corner. Based on Roman architecture, that they would have, the walls just wouldn't have been plain. They would have been fluted or like columns embedded in the walls, just a decoration. That's just somebody's idea of what it might have looked like. Nobody knows. But we do know there were 3 stories of storage rooms around, from one side around the porch, around the back, and back the other side to the porch. 3 stories. Above those 3 stories, the sanctuary is higher than those 3 storage rooms, and around above, in the free story, above the storage rooms, up to the roof of the sanctuary, there were windows. That's why those young priests would climb the golden chains and try to look in, because they put the 4 crowns that were made. No, this is, like I say, this is inaccurate. That's inaccurate. It's an artist representation, and whenever this was made, I don't know, but a lot more is known probably than this drawing. So every representation that I've talked about and will show you, and the next one included, the next video, you can find something that's inaccurate. And it's all imagination, but I'm trying to give you an idea of how big this place was, how grand it was, and of course, to answer back to your question, when they asked Jesus, and he said, about tear down this temple and rebuild it in 3 days, what did the Jews tell Jesus? How long had Herod been building on it? 46 years? 46 years. It was only finished in about 64, 6 years before the Romans destroyed it. Because the sanctuary, as we talked about last week, they trained all those Levitical priests to build the sanctuary so it was untouched by Gentile hands. Once the stones were brought there, it was all built. That was built in a year and a half, 18 months, at least enough that the holy place and the most holy place was enclosed and functioning. Okay, but these courtyards, all of this around it that we're seeing these representations of, this went on until 6 years before the Romans tore it all down. So they just kept coming up. It's kind of like having a wife doing projects. You get one finished. Well, how about another? How about another something here? Or let's change the paint there. They just kept building onto it and improving it or whatever.
Are you going to speak about the destruction?
Later, yes, we will. Yes, we will. Yeah. If we'll wait, that'll be probably our last class. But any questions about the grand tour here? But that stone you can see on the internet. You can see that stone, and the Hebrew inscription is still there that is translated most times to the trumpeting place. And so a fellow would stand up on the top of that tower, wherever that was the banister that kept him from falling off, and that's where he would blow the trumpet, announcing whatever.
Museum in Jerusalem?
David, I don't remember. One of the inscriptions, the wall that separated the Gentiles, there are 2 of those inscriptions. One is in Istanbul, I think. The Ottomans control this, the Ottoman Empire controlled this, and they dug up a lot of things. It's kind of like the British, hold off of half of Athens and the Parthenon, and called them the Elgin Marbles. The Ottomans found one of the stones, and they were in 3 languages, and apparently not every language appeared on every stone. But at those openings, and it probably was accurate, the openings were opposite the gates. On each side were 3 gates in the court of the priests and the court of Israel, and 1 gate in the court of the women, which the video did not show. So there were 4 gates on the north and the south side, and opposite, of course, each of those, there would be a break in this very low fence. It was not intended to keep anybody out physically. It was just warning that you better not go beyond it if you were a Gentile or ceremonially unclean.
So can we readily assume that the Robinson arch, the remnant that is still left on the wall, is the original?
Oh yeah.
Because of the structure?
Yes. Well, you've got tons of stone above it and below it. And so, yes. And it's very typical Roman detail. Dentile molding, where you have a little block in the space that maybe on your crown molding, if you have really expensive crown molding, or around your fireplace. Those stones that are the spring of the arch, that means that's the first stone that's slanted on each side. There's a fancy French word which I can't pronounce for that. Begins with a V. But the spring of the arch each of those stones have to be huge because all of the pressure, all the weight of gravity of the stones and that road on top, you don't just have an arch, you've got a road bed on top of it, a flat road bed. All the pressure, you have what? Gravity this way. The thrust of all of that, the other component, vector analysis, is what? Is on those spring stones. And so they're on the wall side, the other side of course is missing. But on the wall side, they're still there and they're still slanted. But they're dentile. In other words, some of them are exaggerated, and then the next one, it'll still be there, but it won't have the little block below it. And so it's just typical Roman design of the spring stones there. And so that's there, and I don't know, it's just talk or what, but you keep reading on the internet that this is that area now, that west wall area, is called the Jerusalem Archaeological Garden. And of course they're excavating there because the Jews have control of it. And of course the Jews are fighting, and if you want to read something interesting, read the Israeli Supreme Court trying to separate the different sects of Judaism as who gets to pray at what space on the wall. We hear about the Wailing Wall. That's reserved for Orthodox, most conservative Jews, and it's men and women. Well, now the women are saying, why do we have that piece of plexiglass on the, well, so that's a big fight. So that's in the courts. And so you've got women demanding, and the most conservative sect of Judaism, to get rid of the plexiglass wall that separates the men from the women, and the Wailing Wall. But then you go a little bit further down toward the corner, toward Robinson's Arch. Well, now another sect is demanding they can't pray there. The Supreme Court won't let them pray with the conservatives, the Orthodox Jews. So they're now, the less conservative have to move down further toward the corner. And that's all regulated by the Israeli Supreme Court. It is unbelievable. But that's that whole area, and they built platforms so they can continue digging underneath there and excavating while still giving some of these other groups a place to stand and stick their pieces of paper in the wall or whatever they pray in those sections of the wall that are further toward the east. Toward the south, not east, toward the south.
Where is the Muslim Dome of the Rock in relation to the?
Well, it's pretty much in the middle. In the middle. If you go back to that first slide, which we could, where we looked at the Wilson's topographical map, it shows, and remember, Mount Moriah came down like this to a point, and so they had to fill in all this to build that massive platform. But back way in the back, more than halfway back, is where the rock that sticks up, which everybody wants to believe is where Abraham offered Isaac, and that one time the Ark of the Covenant set on that rock, and there's a lot of controversy about that too.
Maybe in terms of the destruction, but I just wanted,
Yeah.
back in Robinson Arch, that was all under dirt and had to be removed to reveal Robinson's Arch,
Yeah.
all that wall.
Yes, all of that. I forget how many courses, but the present level of the Wailing Wall. There is more of Herod's stonework below that Wailing Wall Plaza now than there is above it. Some of the very top above the Wailing Wall, some of it is medieval, Byzantine, Ottoman, and Muslim, but there is actually more of Herod's stonework below the level, distance-wise, of the Wailing Wall Plaza now than above it.
And that's what they're trying to get to?
Yeah, that's what, and well, they can't dig there with the Wailing Wall. That's too. But it says when you get past this holy place that the Orthodox control, now that they've got steel platforms and they're digging under, but they're letting these other Jewish sects, they have to stand on steel platforms, and the archaeologists are digging underneath there, trying to uncover more of it. Yes, yes.
Why did the Romans want to destroy the temple?
Good question. Good question. Because remember, the Jews were troublemakers. They had revolted against Roman rule, and so they besieged Jerusalem, and Josephus tells of the terrible things that they literally starved people. They were eating their children, etc. They were starving. They besieged the city. They finally broke into the city. They stripped, Josephus, I think's description, Jerusalem apparently was a very beautiful area around it. Many, like the Garden of Gethsemane, many places with trees, olive trees, and gardens. And the Romans, Josephus, I think it was, said there wasn't a tree visible for miles around Jerusalem. You wouldn't even recognize it. They stripped all the wood to build siege engines to break down the walls. And then once they broke down the walls, of course, the holdouts fled into the temple, which was a fortified place, as you can imagine, and held out there. And of course, eventually they took the whole city, killed the holdouts in the temple area. And apparently, accidentally, one account says that a Roman soldier with a torch, whether it was night or day, someplace set something on fire. And Pompey and his generals sat on the Mount of Olives and watched the army destroy it. They hated the Jews because the Romans did not tolerate insurrection. They would not have, Milwaukee would not have fared well. Certain people in Minnesota and other places in our day would not have fared well with the Roman army in town. They did not, dissent was not allowed. They revolted against Roman rule, and so they destroyed the city. They destroyed the walls. They destroyed the city. Now, we'll see next week in this next, much of the sanctuary itself, there was a lot of gold and silver on the walls, on the stones. And so once they started turning things upside down and stripping gold, and they just tore it down just to show their contempt and hatred of the Jews as being ungovernable. Other questions? This is a good time for questions. Yes, Lee?
You had said this is a ceremonial area, right? Very front?
The east gate, the east gate, yes, the east gate was a ceremonial because remember that's the Kidron Valley. It's a very steep. That's a steep valley, and so they used it for ceremonial. And we'll talk about the ceremony that took place on the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles later.
Where all the blood drained down?
Well, this pond, this was probably for the collection of water, like rainwater, reusable. We don't know how, as I talked about last week, we don't know how they handled all of the washing of the blood and guts off of, after all, this was a slaughterhouse on that platform north of the great altar in the court of the priest. It was a slaughterhouse. They had 2 rows of 4 marble tables on which, after the animals' throats were cut, and they hung them up to, I'm getting ahead of myself, but we have time, I'll talk. They hung them up, they had posts, they hung the carcasses up and let the blood drain out, and they frayed the animal. To fray means to peel the skin off, to skin it. They skinned the animal, hanging it there. Then the carcass, once the skin was off, of course, whether it was sheep, whether it was ox, leather, the skin to make leather was a valuable thing. So it was removed, and we'll talk about what they did with that. And but there was a clean water for taking runoff of rain off the courtyards, the great plaza of the Gentiles, and there was also a drainage system to handle all of that dirty water that would have. They caught some of the blood. Remember, some of the blood was always caught for sacrifice and poured out or anointed the horns of the altar. But even so, there was a lot of really, animal waste and dirty water that had to be removed. Well, you're on top of a hill. It was easy enough to remove it. The question is, what did they do with it, and where did they send it? And it had to stink because it had so much material that would decay and go anaerobic. and it had to smell worse than any sewer plant you ever rode by that wasn't operating properly. And we know they separated the water, but I cannot find out
It just seems
how they treated it.
amazing, you know.
It's amazing. Thank you very much.